Have you ever stopped to think about how those really huge empires, the ancient ones, didn't just, conquer places. They actually seem to reinvent society itself, like completely new ways of governing, crazy military tactics, even how they built cities or kept records. It's fascinating. Today, we're diving deep into exactly that kind of empire, a civilization whose innovations, let's be honest, were often brutal, but they really did lay the groundwork for superpowers that came way later, millennia later even. We are talking about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and our mission today really is to cut through all the noise, pull out the really crucial stuff from the sources we've gathered, and
Yeah.
basically give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about this absolutely critical, transformative civilization.
That's exactly right. And when we talk about the Neo-Assyrians, we're looking at what you could legitimately call the Near East's first true superpower. This entity really kicks off with Adad-nirari II coming to the throne in 911 BC, and it sticks around politically at least until the fall of Haran in 609 BC, so about 3 centuries. But those 3 centuries, they weren't just battle after battle. It was more like a huge laboratory, a place where they were constantly testing and refining interconnected ideas, military, administrative, even cultural things. They definitely built on what the Middle Assyrians did before them, but they scaled everything up, like exponentially. They figured out how to deepen central control using these enduring tax province networks, really
Hmm.
systematic. They developed a full-time, year-round army. Think about that, relentless annual campaigns, a war machine unlike anything before. And crucially, they pioneered the settlement mechanism based on what we'd now probably call population engineering. It was very calculated, top-down, deliberately reshaping societies and economies to benefit the empire. So our deep dive today, the goal is to really unpick that complex tapestry. How did they rise so high? How did they sustain it for so long? And ultimately, how did it all come crashing down? Because it left this huge indelible mark on pretty much everything that came after.
Okay, let's definitely unpack that. When you talk about the foundations, the very beginning of such a monumental empire,
Hmm.
where do we even start? What were those first really critical steps that set them on that superpower path?
Well, you absolutely have to begin with that early consolidation phase, and that was decisively shaped by Adad-nirari II. He was pretty shrewd. His campaigns, early 10th century BC, weren't just random land grabs. They were about strategically locking down key regions and resources. So, for instance, he systematically took these Aramean strongholds right at the Habur-Euphrates junction, vital spot. I think of them like major crossroads. Controlling them meant controlling trade, communication across Mesopotamia. Huge strategic advantage. And at the same time, he worked on securing the eastern border. He retook Arrapha, that's modern Kirkuk, again, not just taking a city, but a key defensive move protecting the Assyrian heartland from the east. Oh, and he also managed a pretty significant border treaty with the Babylonian king Nabu-shuma-ukin III. That actually paused conflict between the two big Mesopotamian powers for, well, for decades, gave them breathing room.
Okay, so it sounds much more strategic than just, brute force, a long-term vision. And you mentioned expropriation. That sounds significant. Can you clarify what that meant? It's more than just conquest.
Precisely. Yeah, expropriation is the key term here. It goes deeper than just conquest. It wasn't solely about immediate loot, although sure, that happened too. It was about systematically taking ownership of the land and, critically, its productive capacity for the state. So this involved things like meticulous land measurements in the newly conquered areas, like a huge ancient land survey. And then, based on that, they weren't just demanding tribute, they were recording detailed grain and silver taxes, taxes that were expected to be paid regularly, year after year. That's a massive shift, you see. It's about integrating these places into a formal, ongoing economic system designed to feed the imperial center predictably, not just one-off spoils. And this era also sees the start of the first really systematic deportation convoys, a practice that, well, looking back is horrifying, but it became a signature, brutally effective Assyrian policy we need to talk more about. It's control not just of land, but of labor, of people, of economic output itself.
Wow, that level of organization for that time, it really is quite surprising. Almost like a modern state setting up a tax base. So what about the next phase? How do they keep expanding? And maybe more importantly, how do they handle the sheer logistics of it all?
Right, so building directly on what Adad-nirari did, his successor, Tukulti-Ninurta II, he really pushed those logistical corridors further out. He extended them into much tougher terrain, the Zagros mountain passes, the Taurus foothills, difficult places. Now, this wasn't always about direct annexation, like planting Assyrian flags everywhere. Instead, it was often about bringing the
shall we say, fierce tribal groups living there into a formal tribute system. What this did was create these crucial semi-military, semi-tax-paying buffer zones. That's the key phrase. Imagine them like protective shields, concentric rings around the Assyrian core. They provided security against raids, sure, but also a steady flow of resources, materials, animals, maybe even manpower. It shows a really smart understanding of how to control tricky geography without, overstretching their own troops everywhere.
Okay, buffer zones. Makes sense. Now, here's where it gets, I think, really interesting, maybe even unexpected for some people listening. The role of climate. We tend to think empires rise and fall based on generals, kings, battles, but you're suggesting climate played a huge, maybe even foundational role in Assyria's early success.
Oh, absolutely. It's a factor we often miss, but it's crucial. Climate scientists have identified what they call the Assyrian megapluvial. And this wasn't just like a couple of rainy seasons. This was a prolonged phase, about 2 centuries of exceptionally wet weather. And it lines up almost perfectly with their initial rise and expansion. Just picture it. Consistent, abundant rainfall across their main farming lands in northern Mesopotamia. This meant huge food surpluses. More grain than they knew what to do with, probably, healthier animals, more resources overall, and critically, the ability to support a bigger, healthier population. These conditions were absolutely fundamental for their initial growth spurt and their sustained expansion. It literally fueled their capacity to campaign year after year, feed that growing processional army, support the admin needed to run it all. Honestly, without the incredibly favorable climatic window, their expansion would have been much, much harder, maybe impossible on that scale. And it also sets up this almost tragic irony when we look at their later collapse, which, as we'll see, was tied to a dramatic reversal of those conditions. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it? Even the mightiest human empires are often built on, well, environmental luck.
That is a profound connection. Really humbling. So, okay, they've got this incredibly fertile ground, literally and figuratively. The empire starts taking its distinctive, fearsome shape. And when you think of empire building on that grand scale, one name always seems to pop up. Ashurnasirpal II, often seen as this visionary builder, but also, maybe more accurately, a master propagandist. What did he do to really stamp the empire's identity onto the world?
Ashurnasirpal II, yeah, he was a game changer. He really moved beyond just military expansion into something you could almost call an ideological architectural festival. His biggest project, his lasting legacy really, was the complete rebuilding of Talu, modern Nimrud. He took what was basically a rundown old trade center and completely transformed it, replanned it on this immense scale, 360 hectares. That's big, like a decent chunk of a modern city. The city walls alone were over 5 kilometers long, and they deliberately enclosed one corner where he built this massive raised citadel. And up there, only the royal palace and the main temples. A clear separation, a statement of power. This wasn't just construction, it was projecting this image of unparalleled, unchallengeable, divine and royal authority. Every single stone was propaganda.
And he didn't just build walls, right? He used art, grand
Yeah.
spectacle. It wasn't just about physical presence, but psychological dominance, almost theatrical.
Exactly. The visual propaganda was, well, masterful. Those alabaster panels from his palace, they're legendary. They showed these incredibly vivid, almost movie-like scenes. The king hunting lions, brutal sieges, lines of captives bowing down. These weren't just decorations. They visually hammered home this recurring theme you find in his big inscription, the standard inscription. Basically, this chilling idea. Violence breeds prosperity. The message was crystal clear. Assyrian power brings wealth and order if you obey. Resist. Total devastation, no middle ground. And to really drive it home, make it undeniable, he threw this opening feast for Kalhu. Get this. 69,000 guests.
69,000.
69,000 guests entertained for 10 straight days. Can you imagine the logistics? But it wasn't about humble celebration. It was a deliberate, overwhelming spectacle designed to encode this relationship, king generosity and fear. You either got his incredible bounty and protection, or you faced his terrifying wrath. It was meant to inspire both awe and, frankly, terror.
That number is just staggering for an ancient feast. A clear show of force and wealth designed to leave no doubt. And you also mentioned Kalhu was a showcase for population engineering. What did that actually look like on the ground? How did it work?
Yes, Kalhu was the prime example, the showcase for this policy taking shape. They brought in about 16,000 people, artisans, farmers, court officials from all over the empire from different provinces, and they settled them en masse in this brand new city.
This wasn't just convenient relocation, it was Assyria's first big, deliberate experiment in mixing demographics and economies. Imagine whole communities just uprooted from places maybe hundreds of miles away, then resettled in this new, purpose-built city right next to people from totally different backgrounds speaking different languages. The goal was multi-layered and brutally efficient. First, by mixing everyone up, they basically diluted any chance for concentrated rebellion among newly conquered groups. Hard to organize when you don't share a language or history with your neighbors. Second, it let them bring skilled labor and farming know-how directly to areas they wanted to develop or boost production in. It was a calculated, top-down way to shape society and the economy for maximum imperial benefit. Cold, hard resource management, but with people.
So connecting all these dots, the grand building projects, the propaganda, these calculated, sometimes brutal population movements, what does it tell us about their overall strategy? How do they manage to control such a vast territory through both this grandeur and this engineering of populations?
They were absolutely interconnected. They formed the very core of their strategy for systematic central control. Ashurnasirpal's building projects, the visual propaganda, the feasts, all that theater of power, it projected this image of overwhelming imperial authority. It wasn't just about scaring enemies, it was about impressing subjects, reinforcing the king's divine right, creating this pervasive sense of Assyrian dominance. Then, the population management, showcased at Kalu but used elsewhere too, was the practical tool for control. By moving people around, they achieved several things at once. One, they shatter old power bases and social structures in conquered lands, making rebellion much harder by removing local leaders and mixing populations. Two, they move labor and skills where they were needed most, boosting economic output, especially food production, in core areas. And three, it pushed towards a kind of Assyrianization, integrating diverse peoples into the imperial system, the language, the state religion, often by force, of course. So you put it all together, infrastructure, ideology, demography, and you get this cohesive strategy for maintaining tight central control over a huge, diverse empire. It shows a really sophisticated grasp of how to manage territory, and not just with soldiers, but with pervasive political, economic, and cultural pressure, basically engineering a whole new imperial reality.
It really does sound like an empire hitting its stride, almost unstoppable. But, history teaches us that even the strongest empires hit bumps, face internal problems, maybe periods of stagnation. What happened after this incredible burst of growth and consolidation under Ashurnasirpal II? Did the momentum continue?
You're absolutely right. No empire grows forever without facing challenges, and Assyria was no exception. After Ashurnasirpal II, his son, Shalmaneser III, continued the expansion. His reign saw the borders push even further out. We're talking reaching into Cilicia, controlling both sides of the Amanus Mountains, deep into the northern Zagros valleys, a huge territory. This really cemented Assyria as the dominant power. And the Battle of Karkar, around 853 BC, really illustrates this. It's famous because Assyria faced this massive coalition, 11 different kingdoms lined up against them, stretching from Syria down to Israel. The fact that such a huge coalition even formed tells you something. Assyria wasn't just seen as a regional bully anymore. It was a continental-scale threat that demanded a unified response.
11 kingdoms. That's an incredible scale of opposition. What do we actually know about that battle? What does it reveal about Assyria's military and maybe its growing administration?
Yeah, it was a massive encounter. We know a fair bit from the Turk's Tale, this amazing monument Shalmaneser III left. It gives incredibly detailed troop numbers for the enemy coalition, and it describes this really diverse enemy mosaic. It mentions things like mobile Arab dromedary units, camel cavalry, pretty novel then, alongside well-armed Israelite chariots. It shows the sheer breadth of who they were fighting and hints at the immense logistical challenge of their own campaigns, feeding and moving tens of thousands of troops across vast distances. But, and this is crucial, beneath the surface of this military might, an important internal shift was happening. The sheer cost of these huge campaigns, plus managing this enormous empire, meant the palace bureaucracy, the administrators, became much more influential, and this rise of the administrators started to have consequences. During the last decade or so of Shalmaneser III's very long reign, these high-ranking commander-governors, guys like the Tertanu, basically the top general, started becoming powerful figures in their own right. They built up personal wealth, had loyal troops, and started acting a bit like independent power centers, subtly challenging the king's direct authority.
So the seeds of internal division. Powerful generals essentially carving out their own little kingdoms within the empire. What happened next? This leads into what historians call the Great Palace Officials era, right? What did that period of, stagnation actually feel like for the empire?
Exactly. The Great Palace Officials era
roughly 823 to 745 BC, was a really prolonged period of imperial stagnation, almost like a deep sickness in the system. You see several really worrying signs. First, throne succession became messy. Frequent, often violent struggles for the crown. That signals instability right at the top. Constant plotting, maybe assassinations, civil wars over who gets to be king, not a good sign. More fundamentally, the economic share going to the central authority, the king's personal treasury, dropped significantly. Less money flowing directly to the king meant less ability to fund big projects, buy loyalty, project power abroad effectively. And meanwhile, those powerful governors we mentioned, they got even more entrenched. They basically set up their own local dynasties in their provinces, ruling with a lot of autonomy, often putting their own interests ahead of the empire's. For ordinary people, maybe it meant less reliable justice, more local corruption, a feeling the king was far away, his power weakened.
That sounds like a serious decentralization, a kind of slow fraying from the inside out. What were the tangible effects outside the empire? Did enemies notice this weakness?
Oh, absolutely. The external consequences were stark and pretty dangerous. Urartu, their big rival to the north, saw its chance and expanded aggressively. They pushed south, getting to within just 5 days' march of the Assyrian heartland walls. Their influence spread from Lake Van down towards Habor, directly threatening core territories and trade routes, a major threat. And down south, in Babylon, always a tricky area for Assyria. An alliance formed between powerful priests and ambitious local lords. They openly challenged Assyrian control over key fortresses along the Diyal River, another sign of the central government's weakening grip. Economically, the picture was just as bad. Even though the maps might still show a huge Assyrian territory, the royal court actually saw about a 30% drop in the silver recorded in its annual tribute lists.
30%? That's huge.
It's massive. Imagine a modern state losing nearly a third of its income. It was a direct financial hit, showing a real loss of economic control over their supposed vassals. Less money for the army, for building, for everything.
A 30% drop in revenue.
Yeah.
It's crippling for any state, especially when built on continuous tribute and military spending. What were the broader consequences of this long stagnation, particularly for the military, which had been their sharpest tool?
Well, this long stagnation really hit the military hard. It weakened the very backbone of Assyrian power. The army, which had been so dominant earlier, was still relying heavily on these seasonal levies. Farmers fight, then go home. It was just less efficient, slower to mobilize, less adaptable than a truly professional force. And the constant internal instability, the leadership changes, the governors doing their own thing, it disrupted crucial systems. Things like those strategic population shifts, vital for manpower and farming, got messed up. Logistics became less reliable. Projecting power far from home got harder. So combine these internal weaknesses with the growing external threats from Urartu and Babylon. The empire was basically stuck, treading water, maybe even shrinking in real terms, for decades. The whole system was clearly failing. It reached a point where a major reform, a shakeup, led by some decisive figure, wasn't just likely, it was basically inevitable if the empire was going to survive, let alone recover.
That raises that classic historical question, doesn't it? How do empires pull themselves back from the brink? Who was this inevitable reformer? And what radical steps did they take to reverse this decline?
That figure was Tiglath-Pileser III. He seized power in 745 BC through a coup. That itself tells you how bad things were. The old system had to be violently overthrown. But he wasn't just another power-hungry general. He fundamentally reshaped the imperial center. He launched a series of truly revolutionary reforms that basically saved the empire, for a while anyway. His administrative revolution was stunning. He looked at those huge, powerful provinces run by those entrenched governors, and he broke them up, fragmented them into lots of smaller sub-provinces, a classic divide-and-rule tactic, but on a huge scale. Then, each new, smaller unit got a governor appointed directly by him, by the king, and crucially, their jobs rotated every 3 years.
Ah, rotation.
Sure. Very clever. It stopped any single governor from digging in too deep, building a local power base, starting their own little dynasty, kept them loyal to the center. And on top of that, those vast estates owned by the old provincial magnates, confiscated, absorbed into royal lands. This massively centralized both political and economic power right back into the king's hands, a necessary power grab to save the state.
That is a dramatic overhaul of the entire administration.
Yeah.
A real reassertion of royal power.
Yeah.
What about the military? You said it had been weakened by relying on seasonal troops and fractured command. How did Tiglath-Pileser fix the Assyrian war machine?
His military reforms were just as game-changing. He essentially created one of the world's first true standing armies. He established the Kir-Shuri, literally the king's detachment. This was a corps of paid professional soldiers who served year-round. This was huge. Before this, it was mostly seasonal levies. Farmers called up, fight, go home. A standing army meant constant readiness, continuous training, real professional soldiers, career warriors. He also created specialized units. He recognized warfare was getting complex. So chariot drivers, siege engineers, absolutely vital for taking walled cities' heavily armored infantry. They were put on separate rank and pay scales. This boosted their skills, their professional identity, made sure the army had experts for every situation, from open battles to complex sieges. It turned Assyria from having a sort of seasonal militia into a sophisticated professional fighting force ready to go year-round, a military revolution.
And it sounds like this is also when that infamous Assyrian practice, mass deportation, really became a core strategic tool, not just occasional punishment.
Absolutely. Deportations happened before, sure, but under Tiglath-Pileser III, they were systematized with ruthless strategic intent and on an unbelievable scale. Just in his reign, between 744 and 727 BC, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, maybe from over 30 different groups, populations from Hamath, Urartu, the Iranian plateau, all over. And this wasn't random cruelty. It was a deliberate, massive demographic shift. Population engineering on a terrifying scale.
So, okay, not just punishment, not just terror,
Yeah.
but a calculated tool for managing the empire, like a vast, brutal social engineering project. What exactly was the strategic thinking behind moving all these people around? What were they trying to achieve?
Precisely. It was a multi-pronged strategy aimed at both control and economic gain. Most of these displaced people were moved into the central Assyrian provinces, often areas that were maybe less fertile or needed more manpower, but were secure, close to the core. This did two main things, both brutally effective. First, it shattered potential resistance. Uproot people from their homes, scatter them among strangers hundreds of miles away, remove their local leaders. Organizing a rebellion becomes incredibly difficult.
Yeah, they can see that.
Second, it was strategic labor redistribution. It moved skilled farmers, artisans, general laborers to where they were needed to boost food production or other industries. So they increased agricultural output in core areas, strengthening the empire's economic base while simultaneously stamping out dissent in the provinces. It was a cold, calculated, but highly effective way to manage both people and resources for imperial advantage.
Chillingly efficient indeed. Now, the Assyrians weren't just about military force and admin, were they? They were also incredible architects and engineers. We see these amazing monuments they left behind. How did that aspect of their power develop, especially with creating new, purpose-built capitals?
Right. Following Tiglath-Pileser's reforms, his successor, Sargon II, built on that foundation and decided to, well, top it off with a brand new capital city, Dir-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad. This wasn't just moving the capital, it was conceived as an ideal city, like literally planned out on paper before they built anything. And they chose this empty plain, not even particularly great farmland. It was a deliberate act of will, imposing order on the landscape, not just adapting to it. Shows incredible confidence.
An ideal city planned on paper.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. What did this geometric power, as the source called it, actually look like? How did the layout reflect their imperial vision?
The layout was the physical embodiment of that geometric power. It was meant to scream order, control, the king's absolute authority. Sargon's own inscriptions bragged it had no equal in any kingdom. It was perfectly square walls, 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers. 6 massive gates, streets laid out in a strict grid pattern, orthogonal, precise arrangement of the palace, the temples, even the land parcels inside. It wasn't organic, it was mathematical. A symbol of the state's total command. And the population. Also engineered. A mix of families brought in from existing provinces and captive artisans from conquered lands. Land was distributed under royal supervision, often in collective units, not private plots. Again, central control. Militarily, Sargon kept pressure on Urartu with these grinding, binding attrition campaigns in the north, trying to wear them down. But then his death. He died fighting way out on the frontier, in Tabal, in 705 BC. And apparently they didn't recover his body. This was hugely shocking, deeply traumatic. An Assyrian king dying in battle like that, unheard of. It created this deep fear of instability, palace coups, bad omens that haunted the next period.
That fear of coups must have hung heavy in the air. And then Sennacherib, Sargon's son, takes over and decides to move the capital again. This time to Nineveh, transforming it into what became the largest city in the ancient world. How did he pull that off, especially after his father's traumatic death?
Sennacherib inherited a tricky situation, that trauma, his father's unfinished city. But he responded with this absolutely massive infrastructure program focused on Nineveh. He wasn't just building palaces, he was transforming the whole urban environment. He commissioned this incredible canal and aqueduct network, 150 kilometers long.
150 kilometers.
Yeah, think about that distance. It included amazing feats like the Keenest tunnels carved right through rock, and the Jirwan Aqueduct, this huge stone-arched water bridge. Parts of it still stand. The goal was to bring fresh mountain spring water all the way into Nineveh, a massive undertaking, ensuring a clean, reliable water supply for a huge city.
Truly astounding engineering for any time. Was all that water just for drinking? Or did it serve other, maybe more, symbolic, extravagant purposes reflecting Nineveh's status?
Oh, it was definitely more than just drinking water, though that was vital. This incredible water system also fed these extensive hunting parks and botanical gardens outside the city walls. Imagine these lush green areas filled with exotic plants and animals, thriving in a pretty dry region, all thanks to engineered water. It showcased unbelievable planning, luxury, and the king's power over nature itself. Politically, Sennacherib's reign also had major events. The famous siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC, for instance. Jerusalem survived, but the campaign itself was a brutal reminder of Assyria's reach, that vassal tax system stretching from Syria down to Egypt. Then there was the big one, his complete destruction of Babylon in 689 BC. This was hugely controversial even back then. Rising Babylon, the sacred city of Marduk, it really damaged the legitimacy of the Assyrian monarchy in the eyes of many across the Near East, seen as sacrilege. Despite all that, Nineveh itself, under Sennacherib, became immense. Double walls, moats, vast palace and garden complexes. It truly was the largest metropolis of the ancient world, a dazzling, terrifying symbol of Assyrian might.
It's fascinating how they balance this raw power with, as they reach their peak, this intense focus on culture and knowledge. How did that blend play out under Esarhaddon and then his successor, Ashurbanipal? This seems like the absolute zenith.
Esarhaddon's reign, starting 681 BC, was really about two things, reconciliation and then audacious expansion. He knew his father wrecking Babylon was a huge problem, so his first priority was fixing that Babylonian problem. He launched a massive rebuilding program for the city, restored its temples, and, very cleverly, restored royal patronage to the powerful Babylonian priests without trying to control them directly. Smart diplomacy to heal the rift. Once things were calmer internally, he looked outwards, and he went big. He launched the campaign to conquer Egypt. This pushed Assyrian borders to their absolute maximum extent, claiming dominion between two seas, the Persian Gulf and the Med. Huge statement. Taking Memphis, the Egyptian capital, provincializing the Lower Nile, it stretched Assyrian logistics to the absolute limit. But it also opened up Egypt's incredible wealth, grain, fish, luxury goods, pouring new revenue into the treasury. And Esarhaddon also introduced something interesting, enforcing throne succession oaths as actual written treaties imposed on vassals. An early kind of constitutional measure, really, trying to lock in his chosen successor and prevent the succession wars that had plagued them before.
And then comes Ashurbanipal. He seems to embody this peak, this paradox, almost the warrior king, who's also this great scholar and collector of knowledge. Tell us about him and the scholar king idea.
Ashurbanipal, ruling from 668 to around 627 BC, he absolutely represents the empire at its apex, and he embodies that fascinating blend of brutal military power and sophisticated cultural patronage. Militarily, his reign saw huge successes, especially the Elamite campaigns in the east. Assyrian forces pushed all the way to the Persian Gulf Coast. The climax was the utter destruction of Susa, the Elamite capital. They didn't just sack it, they razed it and, according to the texts, sowed salt in the ruins, a symbolic act of total annihilation. But at the exact same time, and this is what's so extraordinary back in Nineveh, Ashurbanipal was overseeing the creation of his famous library. Over 30,000 clay tablets meticulously collected and cataloged. This wasn't just a library, it was a deliberate memory institution, designed to preserve knowledge across the board, divination texts, medical treatises, law codes, great literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh, astronomical records, star catalogs, even plant medicine recipes, a truly vast collection.
So he wasn't just a warrior, he actively cultivated this image of a scholar king, creating this unprecedented library. This really does make the Assyrian court seem like a universal knowledge hub, doesn't it? How did he manage that dual image?
Exactly. Ashurbanipal very carefully crafted this unique propaganda image, the scholar king. You see it in his palace reliefs. On one hand, he's depicted as the ultimate warrior, incredibly strong, famously shown strangling a lion with his bare hands, raw power. But then, right alongside these images, or in inscriptions, he's portrayed as deeply learned, a scholar deciphering complex ancient texts, mastering divination, understanding the secrets of the gods. It wasn't a contradiction to them, it was a deliberate fusion. Violence and knowledge, both aspects of supreme kingship. The library was the ultimate expression of that intellectual side. It aimed to be a universal repository, collecting texts from all over the known world. It transformed the palace into this intellectual powerhouse, preserving knowledge that profoundly influenced later cultures and gives us incredible insight today. It's shown power wasn't just force, it was also controlling information.
That's a really sophisticated way to project power. Okay, let's zoom out one last time before we get to the end. Let's look at the systems that kept this machine running for so long, the military, the economy, that impressive bureaucracy. How did they manage it all?
Well, the imperial bureaucracy they developed was remarkably sophisticated for its time, truly impressive administration. Within about 50 years, the whole empire was divided into over 80 provinces, plus countless smaller units. Each had its admin center. And crucially, these centers used a dual archive system. Formal stuff decrees, histories kept in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, traditional, durable. But for everyday communication orders, logistics, quick messages, they used Aramaic ink on perishable stuff like papyrus or parchment. Much faster, more efficient for daily business. This pragmatic split, Akkadian for permanence, Aramaic for speed, significantly boosted state accounting, tax collection, overall efficiency, like early optimized data management.
And those massive population shifts, the demographic engineering, just how big was it, and what was the ultimate goal beyond just control?
Yeah, the scale was just staggering, truly immense. Conservative estimates put the total number of people moved between 1.5 and maybe even 4.5 million individuals over the empire's life.
4.5 million.
Potentially. A colossal demographic wave, or rather, waves. It was designed, as we said, to transfer agricultural skills and labor to key areas, boosting yields, but also, absolutely critically, to shatter resistance by uprooting potential opposition elites, destroying their local networks and scattering them. It promoted their forced assimilation, their re-Assyrianization, by stripping away their old identities and support systems. A total societal reset, enforced brutally.
An unbelievable degree of control. What about the war machine itself? You said it was way ahead of its time. Can you give us a clearer picture of what made it so effective?
It was terrifyingly advanced, hyper-specialized units, mechanized siege warfare, things other armies wouldn't catch up to for centuries. Picture this. They had these Rapik battering rams, huge machines, but with rotating turrets on top so they could attack walls from different angles. Their heavy infantry used disciplined tortoise formations, shields locked together, almost impervious to arrows. They had fast, light cavalry using composite bows, devastating ranged attacks combined with speed. And their logistics were superb. Supply caravans that could cover 30, 40 kilometers a day routinely. That allowed them to campaign deep in enemy territory for long periods. The structure, too. That professional corps, the Kirshari, backed up by rotating units from the provinces, gave them numbers and flexibility. This whole model, the professional corps, specialization, logistics, it was a clear conceptual precursor to later systems like the Persian immortals and absolutely the Roman legions. Huge influence on military history.
So advanced military, slick bureaucracy, demographic control.
Yeah.
What fueled all this? What was the economic engine driving the Assyrian state?
Yeah. The absolute backbone was sophisticated agriculture, powered by incredible water management. Extensive canals, weirs to control water flow, huge grain silos along the Tigris and Euphrates, reliable irrigation, massive food storage. Sennacherib's Jirwan aqueduct is the famous example, supplying Nineveh with hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of water daily for drinking, farming, those parks. They even built dams with automatic gates on canals like the Atrush. Really advanced engineering to maximize yields. Beyond farming, they had extensive trade networks. They taxed everything moving through their territory. Valuable purple dye from Phoenicia, copper from Cyprus, iron from the Zagros, cedar logs from Lebanon and the north. All this fueled a silver-based money economy. And the system itself was mixed. Large state-run farms alongside private estates, all feeding into this complex but centrally managed economic engine driving wealth to the core.
And culturally. We mentioned the library, but what about their art? How do they leave their mark visually?
Culturally, their palace reliefs are just stunning, a unique sculptural language. They used a mix of high and low relief carving to create this amazing sense of movement. Scenes of war, hunts, religious rituals all flow together in single panels, like a stone narrative film. The panels from Kalhud or Shurukin, Nineveh, they're considered a peak of visual storytelling in the ancient world, so dynamic, so powerful. And yes, the Nineveh Library stands as this monumental achievement of knowledge preservation. Gilgamesh, star catalogs, eclipse records, medical texts, transforming the palace into this universal repository, a real intellectual powerhouse.
It genuinely sounds like an empire built to last forever. an unstoppable, perfectly tuned machine. But history tells a different story. Every empire falls. What finally brought the Neo-Assyrians down after all that power, all that innovation? Was it just internal fighting or something bigger?
Yeah.
Well, the collapse wasn't just internal competition or getting too big, although those definitely played a part. A critical factor, often tragically overlooked until recently, was a devastating environmental catastrophe. Climate change, basically. We have evidence now from places like the Cunaba cave stalactites. They record ancient climate, showing a severe, prolonged megadrought. It lasted maybe 60, 70 years. And crucially, it hit just a few decades after Ashurbanipal's peak, when the empire was already facing internal
A
stresses,
mega drought.
lasting decades.
Yeah, imagine 60 or 70 years of exceptional dryness across their core agricultural lands. It would have crippled their farming base, grain yields plummeting, and that breaks the fundamental cycle. Less food means less tribute, less ability to feed the population, and crucially, less ability to support that huge, expensive standing army. The engine stalls.
So the very climate that helped them rise turned against them catastrophically. How did that environmental stress combine with other problems to cause the final collapse? Exactly. This huge climate stress hitting their food supply and revenue combined disastrously with escalating internal civil war. After Ashurbanipal died, there seems to have been a major succession crisis. This internal fighting, probably made worse by the drought-induced scarcity and economic pain, just shattered central authority. The military likely fractured. They couldn't respond effectively to external threats anymore. And this created the opening. New powers saw their chance. A powerful new dynasty rose in Babylon under Nabopolassar. And critically, these resurgent Babylonians formed an alliance with the Medes, another rising power from the east. And the end, when it came, was swift and brutal, a cascade of defeats. The combined Babylonian and Median forces were overwhelming. Ashur, the ancient religious heartland, fell in 614 BC, a massive symbolic blow. Then, just 2 years later, 612 BC, Nineveh itself, the great capital, the world's biggest city, besieged, captured, utterly destroyed. Shockwaves across the ancient world. The last remnant, a group holding out in Haran, fell in 609 BC. And that was effectively it. Assyria as a political entity ceased to exist. The aftermath was devastation. Desertified fields, canals dried up, populations scattered, garrisons gone. The plains, once called the center of the world, became desolate. The empire just vanished.
So the empire itself crumbles, wiped off the map. But it couldn't have just disappeared without leaving anything behind, right? What lasting impact, what legacy did this first superpower leave, even after it was gone?
You're absolutely right. The ruins remained, but the legacy was much more than just stones. It left these powerful, administrative, military, even ideological templates that were picked up and adapted by later empires for centuries. Take their royal budget province system, for example. That systematic way of organizing territory and taxes. It served as a direct inspiration for the Achaemenid Persian satrapy system. The Persians basically took the Assyrian administrative playbook and adapted it for their own vast empire. Shows how effective it was.
That's a clear administrative handover almost. What about that controversial practice, the mass deportations? Did that resonate later too?
Disturbingly, yes. That practice, while brutal, seemed to echo in later periods. You can see similarities, perhaps, in some of the Hellenistic colonization programs. Now, the motives might have differed. Assyrians focused on control and labor. Hellenistic rulers maybe more on spreading culture and securing territory, but the basic idea of strategically moving large populations to achieve state aims. That concept resonated. It shows how even troubling policies can leave a kind of blueprint. And definitely the military innovations. That professional standing army, the specialized units, the advanced siege techniques, they provided a clear conceptual foundation for armies that came later. Most famously, the Roman legions. Their organization, discipline, engineering focus owes a conceptual debt to the Assyrians. You can even trace echoes later, maybe into the Byzantine thema system, organizing provinces militarily. The Assyrian model for military organization had a really long shadow. So in the end, this empire, 911 to 609 BC, it did way more than just rule the Near East for 3 centuries. It left behind these administrative, military, and ideological blueprints that history kept referring back to. They're still studied today when people talk about state building, centralization, military structures, even the relationship between power and the environment. Its influence, both positive and negative, truly echoes down the ages.
What an incredible and often pretty chilling journey that was. Through the rise, the innovations, the sheer power, and then the dramatic fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. From those groundbreaking systems to that dramatic collapse, partly driven by climate. It's clear they left this complex but undeniable mark on everything that followed. So what stands out to you listening to this? From our deep dive today, How do you see the echoes of Assyria, its strengths, its methods, its vulnerabilities, maybe even in our world?
Well, if you want to connect it to the really big picture, I think their story forces us to consider how things we might think of as distant history, like major climate shifts, can fundamentally wreck political and social structures. That mega drought wasn't just a background detail, it was likely a key factor in their collapse, interacting with their internal problems. It's such a powerful ancient example of how interconnected human history and environmental history really are. And it reminds us, maybe, of the fragility of even the mightiest human creations when faced with profound ecological change, a lesson that still resonates thousands of years later.
A truly humbling and definitely thought-provoking idea to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into history. We really hope you found these insights as fascinating and maybe as sobering as we did. Until next time, keep digging, keep exploring, and keep learning.